Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we are going to Korea, and not the Korea of K-dramas and K-pop and the gleaming modern cities that most people picture when they hear the name. We are going to the Korea of 1,000 years ago, and 500 years ago, and the long stretch of the Joseon Dynasty that shaped Korean women's lives in ways that are still visible in the culture today. We are going to the Korea of the mudang and the Gisaeng and the widows who were locked into their own houses by a law that punished their sons for their remarriage. And we are going to the Korea of the women who found ways, despite everything, to be present in the world. And before we begin, let me tell you the 3 things that will stay with you through this entire story. First, the mudang, the Korean shaman woman, was the spiritual doctor, the grief counselor, the psychotherapist, and the crisis manager of the Korean village community, all in one person. She conducted the gut, the elaborate multi-hour ritual ceremony that moved between comic performance and tragic lamentation, between dancing and weeping and negotiating with the spirits of the dead. And she did this in a social context that simultaneously relied on her completely and looked down on her entirely. The Joseon Dynasty's Confucian government considered shamanism a superstition and tried to suppress it for 500 years. The Korean people continued to call the mudang when someone was sick, when someone had died badly, when the family's luck had turned and no one could explain why. The attempt to suppress the mudang failed because the mudang was providing something that the Confucian social order's official institutions could not replace. She is still practicing today. She is on the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage list. She won. Second, the Gisaeng, the Korean trained entertainer, roughly analogous to the Japanese geisha but with her own specific and distinctive character, was the only Korean woman of the Joseon period who received a formal education. She learned music, poetry, calligraphy, painting, dance, and the arts of sophisticated social engagement. She was also, by law, a member of the lowest social class, the Shaman, the base people, which means Korea managed the specific paradox of making the most educated women in the society simultaneously the most socially stigmatized. Some Gisaeng used their specific freedoms, the freedom to move in public, to speak with men, to engage with the political and artistic world, to produce work of genuine cultural significance. Hwang Jini, who lived in the 16th century, is considered one of the greatest poets in the Korean language, and she was a Gisaeng. Her poems are still read. Her name is still known. The noblemen who kept their wives locked inside their houses and their names off public record are mostly forgotten. Third, the Joseon widow situation was one of the most comprehensively terrible legal arrangements for women in any civilization we have discussed in this long series of evenings. She could not remarry. She was expected to remain in her dead husband's household for the rest of her life, managing her son's households as a senior woman but having no independent existence. If she did remarry, and some did because human beings under impossible constraints sometimes make the human choice, her sons were barred from the government examinations, which meant they were barred from official careers, which meant they were barred from the primary path to social advancement in Joseon Korea. The widow's remarriage did not just affect her. It destroyed her children's futures. The system made the widow's personal choice a weapon pointed at her own children, which is one of the more sophisticated mechanisms of social control we have encountered, and we have encountered a considerable number of them. So go ahead and get comfortable. Lights down, blanket up. This one is slow and calm and going nowhere fast. And if you haven't subscribed yet, we're here every night, new story, same pace, lights always low. Let's begin. Korea is a peninsula, a tongue of land extending southward from the Asian mainland, bounded on the west by the Yellow Sea and on the east by the Sea of Japan, connected to the north to what is now Manchuria and China. The peninsula's geography shaped its history in specific ways. Close enough to China to be profoundly influenced by Chinese culture, civilization, and political pressure, distinct enough in its geography to develop its own cultural identity, and, particularly in the southern portions of the peninsula, defensible enough to maintain political independence through many of the centuries when Chinese imperial expansion was a constant pressure. The Korean civilization that developed on this peninsula has a history of considerable length. The archaeological record pushes the origins of Korean cultural distinctiveness back several thousand years, and the historical record of Korean states begins in the period around the 1st centuries BCE and CE with the three kingdoms of Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla. The unification of the peninsula under the Silla kingdom in the late 7th century CE and the subsequent Goryeo dynasty, 918-1392 CE, produced the political and cultural foundation on which the Joseon dynasty was built. The Joseon dynasty, established in 1392 CE by Isangai and lasting until the Japanese annexation of 1910, is the dynasty that most directly shaped the Korea of the traditional period. And it is the dynasty whose treatment of women is most extensively documented and most directly relevant to the questions we are asking tonight. Joseon lasted 518 years, which is a long time for any dynasty, and during that long stretch the dynasty's founding ideology, Neo-Confucianism, specifically the variety developed by the Chinese philosopher Zhu Xi and adopted by the Joseon founders as the organizing principle of the new state, shaped Korean society in ways that were profound and in many respects permanent. Neo-Confucianism in its Joseon form was a demanding and comprehensive social philosophy that prescribed the proper relationships between people, ruler and subject, father and son, husband and wife, older brother and younger brother, friend and friend, and that organized the entire social order around the maintenance of these relationships in their correct form. It was a philosophy of order, of hierarchy, of the proper placement of every person in the social structure that the hierarchy required. For women, the Neo-Confucian order had specific and detailed implications. The three obediences, the woman's obedience to her father before marriage, to her husband after marriage, and to her son after widowhood, organized a woman's life around a sequence of male authorities that was supposed to be comprehensive and continuous. The 7 grounds for divorce, the conditions under which a husband could divorce his wife, specified the behaviors that the order considered incompatible with proper wifely conduct, including disobedience to the parents-in-law, failure to produce a son, adultery, jealousy, hereditary disease, excessive talking, and theft. The 7 grounds were balanced by the 3 exceptions, conditions under which a wife could not be divorced even if the grounds existed, but the overall structure placed the man in the position of the judge of the woman's conduct and the woman in the position of the person being judged. The inner quarters, the anbank, the women's domain within the Korean household, was the physical expression of this social order. The proper Korean woman lived in the inner quarters, received no male visitors who were not immediate family, did not venture into the outer courtyard where male guests were received, and did not go beyond the household walls without specific and supervised purpose. The degree to which this enclosure was enforced in practice varied enormously by social class and by the specific circumstances of individual households. A poor farming woman who had to work in the fields could not maintain the inner quarters ideal regardless of what the ideology prescribed. But as an ideal, it organized the expectations of proper female conduct throughout the Joseon period. Let's begin, as we always begin, with the morning. The morning in a Korean household in the Middle Joseon period, let's say the 16th century, the period of Huang Jini and of the administrative consolidation that had made the Neo-Confucian order most thoroughly operative in the lives of Korean women. Before dawn in Joseon, Korea, the morning that never changed. The Korean household of the Joseon period was organized around the ondol, the underfloor heating system that was one of the most distinctively Korean architectural features, a system of channels under the floor through which hot air from the kitchen fire passed, heating the stone floor that the family slept and sat on. The ondol made the Korean floor the warmest and most comfortable surface in the house, which is why the floor-sitting culture of Korea, the sitting, eating, and sleeping directly on the floor, developed and persisted, and why the management of the fire that heated it was one of the most fundamental household functions. The woman of the Korean household woke before dawn. The fire that heated the ondol and cooked the morning meal had to be started, and the fire required the specific management of the agungi, the firebox at the outer edge of the kitchen that fed the fire to the ondol channels. The wood or the coal had to be loaded, the fire had to be started from the previous night's embers, the temperature of the floor had to be brought to the level that the family's comfort required. This was morning work before morning light, conducted in the specific cold of the Korean winter that the ondol was designed to manage, but that required management to manage it effectively. The morning meal, the first of the 3 daily meals that the Korean household required, was prepared in the kitchen that was simultaneously the cooking space and the heating system's engine. Rice was the staple. The cultivation of rice in the paddy fields of the Korean lowlands was the agricultural foundation of the Korean food system, and the cooking of rice in the ceramic pot over the fire was the first and most fundamental kitchen task. The rice had to be washed, measured, cooked to the specific texture that Korean cuisine required, not mushy, not underdone, but the specific consistency that the experienced cook produced through the management of the water and the fire. The soup, guk, was the other constant of the Korean morning meal. Korean cuisine has a soup culture of considerable depth, and the variety of soups that appear in the historical records of the Joseon period reflects both the regional diversity of Korean ingredients and the creative management of what was available. The soup was prepared alongside the rice, the ingredients, vegetables, dried fish, mushrooms, seaweed, whatever the season and the household's resources provided, simmered in the ceramic pot until the flavors were right. The side dishes, the banchan, that completed the Korean meal required their own preparation and management. The most distinctively Korean of these was kimchi, the fermented vegetable preparation that is the most ubiquitous and most culturally significant element of Korean cuisine, consumed at every meal by every social class throughout the Joseon period. Kimchi was not made daily. It was made in large batches, typically in the autumn during the Kimjang season when the Napa cabbage harvest provided the raw material, and stored in ceramic ongi jars buried in the ground where the constant temperature maintained the fermentation at the appropriate rate through the winter months. The Kimjang, the autumn kimchi making, was one of the most significant collective domestic events of the Korean year. Women from multiple households gathered together to make kimchi in quantities sufficient to last through the winter, combining their labor to manage the enormous physical task of washing and salting and seasoning and packing the cabbage in quantities that individual households could not easily manage alone. The Kimjang gathering was a social event as well as a productive one. The hours of working together provided the conversational context that women's community life in the relatively enclosed world of the Korean household required. The morning also included the performance of ancestral rites. The Joseon Neo-Confucian culture placed enormous weight on the performance of ritual obligations to the ancestors. The Jesa, the memorial ceremonies that marked the anniversary of ancestors' deaths and the major ritual occasions of the year, were among the most important ritual activities of the Korean household. The preparation of the ritual food for the Jesa, the specific dishes that the ritual required, prepared with specific care and served in specific arrangements on the ritual table, was women's work, and the skill of preparing Jesa food properly was one of the markers of household competence. The ancestral rites required a specific kind of domestic labor that was different from the ordinary cooking labor of the daily meals. More precise, more ritually freighted, more subject to evaluation by the extended family who attended the ceremonies and who could form opinions about the quality of the food preparation that reflected on the woman who had prepared it. The daughter-in-law who prepared the Jesa food badly, who used the wrong ingredients, who arranged the dishes incorrectly, who produced food that was not of the required quality, was a daughter-in-law who had failed in front of the extended family in a setting where the failure was very visible. The textile work was the background constant of the Korean household woman's productive life, as it was for women in every civilization we have discussed. Korean textile production in the Joseon period was organized around hemp and ramie for the common people and silk for the elite, with cotton becoming increasingly important through the Middle Joseon period as cotton cultivation spread. The spinning and weaving of these fibers was women's work, and the production of the household's clothing and the household's contribution to the various textile obligations, the taxes paid in cloth, the gifts of fabric that social occasions required, the ritual textiles needed for the Jesa ceremonies, was a continuous productive responsibility. The inner quarters, what the enclosure actually looked like from inside. Let's spend some time inside the Anbank, the inner quarters, understanding what the physical enclosure of Korean women's lives actually looked like in practice, because the ideology and the reality were not always the same thing, and the gap between them is where the most interesting aspects of Joseon women's lives are often found. The Korean traditional house, the hanok, was organized around the specific spatial division that the Neo-Confucian gender ideology required. The sarangi, the outer building, the men's quarters, was where the male head of the household received guests, conducted business, engaged with the scholarly and political world. The anki, the inner building, the women's quarters, was where the women of the household lived and worked and managed the domestic operations. The two were connected by a courtyard and by the kitchen that served both, but the movement between them was regulated by the specific conventions that the ideology prescribed. The inner quarters were not simply a place of confinement. They were a place of work, of social life, of creative activity, of the specific kind of community that develops among people who share a physical space for most of their waking lives. The women of the household, the senior wife, the daughters-in-law, the daughters, the female servants, formed a community within the inner quarters that had its own social dynamics, its own hierarchy, its own patterns of cooperation and conflict. The senior woman of the household, typically the mother-in-law, the wife of the household's male head, was the authority of the inner quarters in the same way that her husband was the authority of the outer domain. She managed the domestic operations, the food production, the textile production, the ritual preparations, the management of the female servants, with a real authority that the ideology acknowledged even as it subordinated her in turn to her husband's authority in the broader household. The specific daily life of the inner quarters was busy in the way that all productive domestic life is busy. The cooking, the sewing, the childcare, the management of the household stores, all of this happened in the inner quarters under the senior woman's direction. The embroidery, the specific Korean textile art of newbie needlework, the padded fabric that produced the quilted garments and household items that were one of the most valued products of Korean women's craft, was produced in the inner quarters by women who had developed the skill over years of practice. The education of daughters happened in the inner quarters, transmitted from mother to daughter or from the senior women of the household to the younger ones. The specific knowledge that a Korean woman needed, the ritual preparations for the jesa, the cooking techniques for the specific dishes of the Korean culinary tradition, the textile skills, the household management practices, was transmitted through this domestic education rather than through any formal institutional channel. But not all knowledge was domestic. The women of the literate Yangban class, the Joseon aristocracy whose male members participated in the scholarly culture of the Confucian tradition, were often literate in Hangul, the Korean script developed by King Sejong in the 15th century, and some were literate in classical Chinese as well. The literacy of Yangban women was not formally encouraged by the Neo-Confucian ideology, which generally did not see female scholarship as a positive thing, but the specific circumstances of many Yangban households. Scholarly fathers who could not resist teaching daughters who showed aptitude, husbands whose scholarly conversations spilled over into the inner quarters, produced women who could read and write at a level that the ideology did not quite admit was appropriate for them. The women who wrote in Joseon Korea produced a distinctive literary tradition in Hangul, the Seijo poetry form, the Gasa narrative poetry, the letters and diaries that preserved the inner life of the inner quarters. This literature has been preserved and is now studied as one of the significant achievements of Korean literary culture, which represents a reversal of fortune from the period of its production, when the same texts were considered of doubtful propriety by the Confucian establishment. The household correspondence was one of the primary vehicles for women's writing. The letters between mothers and daughters, between sisters, between women friends who had been separated by marriage, preserve the emotional content of women's social lives with a directness that the more formal literary compositions sometimes lack. These letters, the Ganjichop, the letter collections that some families preserved, give us access to what women were thinking and feeling in the specific domestic world of the inner quarters, and they are one of the most valuable sources we have for Joseon women's inner lives. The mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law, Korea's most structurally inevitable conflict. Let's talk about the relationship that organized more of the daily life of Korean women than any other single relationship. The relationship between the mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law, the Siamonim and the Mayanuri, that was the defining social dynamic of the Joseon household. This relationship was structurally predetermined to be difficult in specific ways. The Confucian family system that the Joseon Dynasty institutionalized required the young wife to move from her birth family into her husband's family household. She left everything she knew and went to live among strangers who were connected to her only through the person she had just married. The mother-in-law was the senior woman of this strange household, the person who had been managing it for years or decades before the daughter-in-law arrived, and whose authority within the household was both established and, from the mother-in-law's perspective, potentially threatened by the new arrival's relationship with the son. The son was the center of the tension. The Confucian prescription of filial piety meant that the son's primary obligation was to his parents, specifically his mother. The Western romantic tradition that prioritizes the marital relationship, the idea that the spouse should come first among a person's earthly attachments, was not the Joseon ideal. In the Joseon ideal, the mother's claim on the son's loyalty was prior and superior to the wife's claim, and the mother who felt that her son was being drawn away from his filial duties by his attachment to his wife was a mother who had, from the perspective of the ideology, a legitimate grievance. This structural tension was expressed in the daily life of the inner quarters through the specific patterns of authority and submission that the household's social order required. The daughter-in-law was expected to wake first, earlier than the mother-in-law, to begin the morning's preparations, so that when the mother-in-law rose everything was already underway. She was expected to serve the mother-in-law before serving herself. She was expected to ask permission for activities that the mother-in-law's authority covered. She was expected to defer in disputes. She was expected to demonstrate by continuous small acts of service and deference the hierarchy that the Confucian order prescribed. Whether she actually felt the deference she performed was a different matter, and the household literature of the Joseon period, the diaries, the letters, the occasional memoirs, preserves evidence of the gap between the performed submission and the inner state that the performance concealed. Women wrote to each other about mothers-in-law who were unreasonable, who found fault without cause, who made the daily management of the household impossible through their criticism. They wrote about the specific exhaustion of sustained performance, the constant vigilance required to maintain the forms of deference in a household where relaxation meant mistake. They also occasionally wrote about mothers-in-law who were kind. The relationship was not inevitably hostile. The same structural conditions that produced conflict could also produce a genuine warmth between women who found in each other competent colleagues in the management of a shared household. The mother-in-law who recognized a capable daughter-in-law and gave her increasing authority and trust. The daughter-in-law who recognized the experience and knowledge of a capable mother-in-law and genuinely sought her guidance. These relationships existed too, and the literature preserves them alongside the difficult ones. The children were the moderating factor that the relationship eventually produced. When the daughter-in-law bore children, especially when she bore sons, which was the primary thing the household needed from her in the Joseon system, her position in the household shifted. She was now the mother of the household's heirs, which gave her a claim on the household's resources and a connection to the household's future that her personal relationship with the mother-in-law had not provided. The son who was both the mother-in-law's son and the daughter-in-law's son became the human bridge across which the two women's interests, previously divergent, became aligned. The transition from daughter-in-law to mother-in-law, which every woman in the system expected to make eventually, since the Joseon woman who survived to middle age expected to see her sons marry and bring daughters-in-law into the household, was one of the most significant transitions in a Korean woman's life. She moved from the position of the person subject to authority to the position of the person exercising it, and the specific way she exercised it was often shaped by her own experience of having been subject to it. Some women became the mother-in-law they had wished they had. Some became the mother-in-law they had suffered under. And most were somewhere in between, because the structural conditions that made the relationship difficult did not disappear with the transition of roles. The mudang, the woman who talked to the dead. Let's talk about the mudang, because the mudang is one of the most extraordinary figures in the history of women's spiritual authority in any tradition, and her story, the story of how a woman's spiritual vocation was simultaneously the most necessary and the most socially stigmatized thing she could be, is one of the most revealing stories about women's position in Joseon Korea. The mudang, the Korean shaman, was the specialist in the management of the relationship between the human world and the spirit world. In the Korean cosmological understanding that predated and persisted alongside the official Buddhism of the Goryeo Dynasty and the official Confucianism of the Joseon Dynasty, the world was inhabited by spirits, the spirits of the dead, the spirits of natural features, the protective spirits of the household, the malevolent spirits who caused illness and misfortune, and the management of these spirits required a specialist who had the specific capability of communicating with them. The mudang's calling was not typically chosen. It was imposed by the spirits themselves through a process called sinbyong, the shaman sickness. A person who was chosen by the spirits to be a shaman experienced a period of severe illness, physical symptoms, psychological disturbance, the specific combination of suffering and visionary experience that the tradition interpreted as the spirits forcing their chosen person to accept the calling. The sinbyong could last for months or years, and the only resolution was to accept the calling and undergo the initiation that transformed the sick person into a practicing mudang. The specific gender dynamics of Korean shamanism are complex and have been the subject of considerable scholarly attention. The majority of Korean shamans were women. Not all of them. The tradition includes male shamans called Baksu Mudang or Manshin, but women were the dominant practitioners. The reasons for this are debated. Some scholars point to the social marginality that the mudang's role required, the liminal position between the human and spirit worlds, outside the conventional social order, as being more compatible with women's already marginal social position in the Confucian hierarchy. Others point to the specific spiritual capacities that the tradition associated with femininity. Others point to the specific social conditions that drove women toward the mudangs. Vocation. The initiation of the mudang, the nair and gut, the ceremony that formalized the acceptance of the calling and established the specific spirits that would work with the new mudang, was a major ritual event conducted by the new mudang's spiritual mentor, the experienced mudang who would train her and who would be her primary guide in the practice. The relationship between the new mudang and her spiritual mother was one of the defining relationships of her life as a practitioner, analogous in some ways to the apprenticeship relationships that structured knowledge transmission in other specialized fields. After the initiation, the daily life of the mudang was organized around the practice. She had clients, people who came to her because they needed help with specific problems that the spirit world was understood to be relevant to. A family member had died in circumstances that suggested spiritual unease, and the family needed the mudang to conduct the ceremony that helped the dead person's spirit make the transition properly. A household had been experiencing a run of bad luck, illness, business failures, family conflicts, and needed the mudang to identify the spiritual cause and address it. A person was sick in ways that the available medical treatment had not been able to resolve, and needed the mudang's assessment of the spiritual dimension of the illness. The gut, the major shaman ceremony, was the most elaborate expression of the mudang's practice and one of the most complex ritual performances in the Korean tradition. A full gut could last from a few hours to several days, depending on its purpose and the resources of the commissioning family, and it involved the mudang transforming herself through the specific costumes and movements and chanting associated with each of the deities in the Korean shamanic pantheon, embodying each spirit in sequence, speaking in the spirit's voice, receiving the spirit's message for the client, and moving on to the next spirit in the ritual sequence. The performance dimension of the gut is one of the most distinctive aspects of Korean shamanism. The mudang was a performer. She danced, she chanted, she sang, she enacted dramatic scenes, she made the audiences laugh and cry. The gut was simultaneously a religious ceremony, a theatrical performance, and a psychological event that mobilized the emotional resources of the participants in service of the healing or the resolution that the ceremony sought. A mudang who was not skilled as a performer was a mudang who was less effective in her practice, because the emotional engagement of the participants, the willingness to be moved, to cry, to laugh, to communicate with the spirit being channeled, was part of what made the ceremony work. The specific ritual of the Gisaeng gut, the shaman ceremony for the dead, is one of the most emotionally powerful ceremonies in any religious tradition. The mudang, channeling the spirit of the recently dead person, speaks in that person's voice to their family, says what the dead person could not say in life, expresses what could not be expressed, addresses the specific griefs and guilts and unfinished business that death left unresolved. The family weeps. The mudang weeps with them. The emotional release of the ceremony is understood as genuinely therapeutic, as doing for the living the psychological work that the death has made necessary. The social position of the mudang was paradoxical in the specific way that we have come to recognize as characteristic of women whose power is simultaneously necessary and threatening to the official social order. She was called when she was needed, in illness, in grief, in the various crises that the spirit world was understood to be relevant to, and she was looked down on when she was not needed. The Neo-Confucian establishment of Joseon Korea viewed the mudang as a practitioner of superstition, a threat to the proper social order, a figure whose influence over credulous people was to be discouraged. The government periodically issued prohibitions on shamanic practice. The mudang continued to practice because the people who needed her continued to need her regardless of what the government said about it. The specific class position of the mudang reinforced the paradox. She was typically a woman of low social origin, often the daughter of a mudang, often from the Shaman class that occupied the lowest tier of the Joseon social hierarchy. Her low social origin was used to justify the low social regard in which the Neo-Confucian establishment held her. But the same low social position gave her a freedom that higher status women did not have, the freedom to move in public, to interact with people of different classes and genders, to occupy the specific social spaces that her practice required. The mudang's economics were also distinctive. She was a professional, she charged for her services, she received payment in various forms, she managed a practice as a business in ways that required the specific commercial skills of the independent practitioner. The payments she received in food, in cloth, in money, in various goods, were the economic foundation of her household. She was, in many cases, the primary economic provider for her family, because her practice was a viable economic operation in ways that other occupations available to low-class women were not. Huang Jini, the Gisaeng who became a legend. Let's meet Huang Jini, because Huang Jini is one of the most famous women in Korean history, and the specific form of her fame as a Gisaeng, as a poet, as a woman who exercised an extraordinary degree of control over her own life in a social context that offered women very little control, makes her one of the most interesting figures in the entire Korean tradition. She was born sometime around 1506 CE in the city of Gisaeng, which had been the capital of the Goryeo dynasty and which remained an important city in the early Joseon period. The specific circumstances of her entry into the Gisaeng system are not entirely clear from the historical record. The sources that preserve her story are mostly later accounts, some of which may have elaborated the legend rather than preserving the exact historical facts. What is clear is that she was a Gisaeng in Gisaeng, that she was remarkable for her beauty and her intelligence, that she was an accomplished poet who composed in both the Sijō and the Chinese verse forms, and that she became famous enough in her own lifetime to attract the attention and the documented admiration of some of the most prominent men of the period. The Gisaeng system of Joseon Korea was a specific institutional arrangement that had its own complex history and its own specific character. Gisaeng were women who were registered with the state as entertainers, musicians, dancers, poets, companions at official banquets and gatherings. They were formally members of the Shaman class, the lowest tier of the Joseon social hierarchy, a status that was hereditary. The daughter of a Gisaeng was a Gisaeng regardless of any other factor. They were subject to the authority of local government offices, which managed their registration and their assignments. In exchange for this status, the stigma, the hereditary bondage, the subjection to official authority, Gisaeng had something that almost no other Korean women had: education. They were trained in music and dance and poetry and calligraphy and the other arts that made them valued entertainers. And this training gave them access to the cultural world of the Joseon elite in ways that other women of comparable social origin could not approach. The training began in childhood for girls who were identified as Gisaeng. Music, the Gaegeum, the traditional Korean zither, the hegeum, the two-stringed fiddle, percussion instruments, was taught systematically, with the understanding that performance at the level expected by the Yangban elite required years of serious practice. Dance, the specific court dances and folk dances that Gisaeng performed at official functions, was taught with the same seriousness. Poetry, both the composition and the appreciation of Korean sijō and Chinese verse, was part of the curriculum, because the ability to produce a well-timed poem in a social gathering was one of the most valued entertainments of the Joseon elite. Hwang Jini's poetry is the thing that has survived most completely and most powerfully from her life, and it is the thing that most directly demonstrates why she was remarkable even within the already remarkable category of the educated Gisaeng. Her sijō, the three-line Korean verse form that was the primary lyric poetry form of the Joseon period, are among the most celebrated in the Korean literary tradition, anthologized and studied and quoted for 500 years. Her most famous poem is addressed to a man who is leaving her, and it uses the image of cutting in half the long winter night, dividing it like a piece of cloth, and folding the dark hours away for safekeeping, to be brought out and unfolded when he returns to her. The image is precise and unexpected and entirely right in the way that the best images in the best poems are right. You feel it in the body before you understand it in the mind, the specific quality of grief and desire and the management of absence that the image contains. The stories told about Hwang Jini in the subsequent tradition, stories that accumulated around her name in the centuries after her death and that are not always distinguishable from legend, emphasize her wit, her confidence, and her specific willingness to challenge the self-importance of the men around her. There is a story about a famous Buddhist monk named Jajak who had maintained a vow of celibacy for 30 years, and who was so famous for his spiritual discipline that people considered him a living saint. Hwang Jini, the story says, seduced him, and then she wrote about it. There is a story about a famous Confucian scholar named Gisaeng who considered himself too dignified to associate with a Gisaeng and who made a public point of this dignity. Hwang Jini, the story says, found a way to make him visit her anyway, and then she wrote about that too. These stories may be legend rather than history. The specific details may be elaborations of a later tradition that found in Hwang Jini a useful figure for a specific kind of cultural commentary, the woman who cuts the self-important men down to size, who finds the gap in their dignity and steps through it. Whether or not the specific stories are accurate, they tell us something about what Hwang Jini came to represent in the Korean cultural imagination, the woman who was fully present in the world, who engaged with it on her own terms, who used her specific position and her specific capabilities to navigate a social world that was not designed for her benefit. She died sometime in her 30s, probably. The exact date is not known. She was not buried with the honors that a Yangban woman would have received. She was a Chanman, but her poems were preserved and her name was remembered, and 500 years later she is one of the most famous people in Korean history, which is a specific kind of posthumous justice that the social order of the Joseon dynasty did not intend and could not prevent. The Joseon widow, a life sentenced without a trial. Let's talk about the widow, because the Joseon widow situation is one of the most comprehensive legal arrangements for female immobility that any civilization produced, and the specific mechanisms by which it was enforced, the way it weaponized the widow's love for her children against her own interests, is worth understanding in its full detail. The remarriage prohibition for Joseon widows was formally established in the Gyeongguk Taejun, the Great Code of the Joseon Kingdom, the fundamental legal document of the dynasty promulgated in 1485, which specified that the sons and grandsons of women who had married twice could not sit for the civil service examinations. The civil service examinations, the Guejo, were the primary mechanism of social mobility and social status in Joseon Korea, the path through which men from the Yangban class demonstrated their scholarly attainment and competed for the government positions that gave social standing and material security. The logic was straightforward and brutal. If the widow remarried, her sons could not take the examinations. If the sons could not take the examinations, they could not hold government positions. If they could not hold government positions, they were cut off from the primary path to the kind of life that the Yangban value system considered worth living. The widow's personal choice to remarry, to have an adult life rather than a suspended one, to seek the companionship and the practical support that a second husband might provide, was encoded as a harm to her children that no responsible mother would inflict. The system was not simply a law. It was a moral framework that the entire Yangban society enforced through continuous social pressure. The widow who maintained her chastity, who stayed in her dead husband's household, who raised her children in the correct Confucian manner, who wore the mourning white for the prescribed period, who conducted the ancestral rites with appropriate precision, was a figure of social admiration. The Joseon government honored chaste widows with the Yolio, the Chaste Women Memorial, a formal recognition of their virtue that could be awarded to families, and that was a significant social honor. The Yolio gates, the memorial arches erected to honor chaste widows, were physical monuments in the landscape of Joseon Korea, visible markers of the ideology's values. A family whose women had received the Yolio distinction had something to display, something to be proud of in the specific form that the Confucian social order defined pride. The memorial arches were community endorsements of the principle that a woman's highest virtue was her fidelity to a dead husband, and their visibility in the community made the principle impossible to ignore. The women who refused to remarry, who maintained their widowhood with the formal virtue that the system required, were real people managing real lives in real circumstances of considerable difficulty. The widow in a Yangban household was the senior woman of the household after her mother-in-law's death, with the real authority and the real responsibility that this position entailed. She managed the household's finances, organized the children's education, maintained the household's social relationships, conducted the ancestral rites. The authority was genuine, though it was circumscribed by the Confucian framework that always placed a male authority, the eldest son, eventually, above her in the formal hierarchy. The widow in a less prosperous household faced harder circumstances. Without a husband's income or the resources of a substantial household, the widow had to manage the family's survival in conditions that were genuinely difficult. The specific economic vulnerabilities of widowhood, the dependence on sons whose economic situations might themselves be precarious, the absence of the male labor that agricultural households required for heavy work, the management of resources that a single adult had to stretch to cover the needs of a household, were the daily reality of the poor widow's life, and they were not managed by ideological commitment to the chaste widow ideal. Some widows did remarry, despite the penalties. The records of the Joseon period include cases of widows who remarried and who accepted the consequences for their sons' examination eligibility, sometimes because they had no sons and therefore no sons' futures to damage, sometimes because the specific circumstances of their situation made the economic logic of the prohibition insufficient to override the human need for companionship and support, sometimes because they were too poor or too young or too outside the Yangban framework for the ideology's enforcement mechanisms to reach them effectively. The distance between the official prohibition and the lived reality of widowhood was one of the regular gaps between Joseon ideology and Joseon life, and the existence of the gap, documented in the legal records of violations and the social commentary of the period's literature, tells you something important about the limits of even the most comprehensive social control. The women of the royal court, Naori, palace women, and the inner institution. The royal court of Joseon Korea maintained its own specific community of women, the palace women who staffed the inner court of the Korean kings, and this community had its own internal structure, its own hierarchy, its own specific daily life that was different from both the Yangban household and the ordinary commoner's household. The Gungyo, the palace women, sometimes translated as court ladies, were women who entered the palace service as girls, typically between the ages of 4 and 8, and who spent their entire adult lives in the palace. They were selected from specific social backgrounds, not from the highest Yangban families, whose daughters were not sent to palace service, but from the somewhat lower rungs of the Joseon social hierarchy, and they entered the palace's educational system, which trained them in the specific skills that palace service required. The training was systematic and demanding, reading and writing in Hangul, and for some positions in classical Chinese as well. Music. The specific music of the court ceremonials that the palace women performed at official occasions. Sewing and embroidery. The royal household's textile needs were met by the palace women's production, and the quality required was the highest in the kingdom. Cooking. The royal kitchen's operations required the management of specific women with specific culinary skills. Medical knowledge. The palace employed women physicians called yuinyo, who were trained specifically to treat the women of the inner court, because the propriety of male physicians treating royal women was questionable. The hierarchy of the palace women was elaborate and precisely specified. The senior positions, the sangung, the chief palace ladies who managed the different departments of the inner court, were positions of real institutional authority. A sangung who managed the royal kitchen, who oversaw the preparation of the king's meals and the management of the kitchen's considerable resources, was a woman with genuine administrative responsibility. A sangung who managed the royal wardrobe, who supervised the production and care of the royal family's clothing, was managing a significant textile enterprise. The daily life of the palace women was organized around the service requirements of the royal family. The early morning began with the preparation of the king's morning meal, the management of the morning ceremony that organized the royal family's day, the various duties that the palace's institutional schedule required. The palace women who served in proximity to the king or the queen had the most demanding schedules. They were available whenever they were needed, which in a royal court meant essentially always. The specific relationship between the king and the palace women was one of the more complex aspects of the inner court's social organization. The palace women who attracted the king's personal attention, who became gungyo, royal favorites, or who were promoted to the status of royal concubine, moved into a different position in the palace hierarchy, one with specific privileges and specific vulnerabilities. The stories of royal favorites and royal concubines in the Korean historical tradition are numerous and often tragic, because the competition for the king's attention and the management of the political implications of that attention was one of the most dangerous games in the Joseon court. The mothers of royal sons had specific political significance. A woman whose son became king became the queen mother, the Diwangtewa Wanghu, and the political authority of queen mothers in the Joseon period was real and sometimes decisive. The history of the Joseon dynasty includes several periods when queen mothers served as regents for child kings or exercised influence over adult kings whose political situation made the queen mother's support essential. The specific mechanisms of this influence, the management of court factions, the control of access to the king, the management of the king's domestic environment in ways that shaped his political decisions, were the same mechanisms we have seen in other courts in other civilizations, organized through the specific institutional structure of the Korean inner court. The palace women who did not attract the king's personal attention, the majority, lived in the palace for their entire lives as institutional workers, performing their specific functions in the palace's operational hierarchy. They did not leave the palace except on specific official occasions. They did not marry. Palace women were required to remain celibate, which meant that the women who entered the palace as children lived their entire adult lives without the marriage and family structure that organized almost every other Korean woman's life. The specific psychological and social world that this created, the community of women who had been selected from outside the palace as children and who had spent their adult lives inside it, with the specific relationships and hierarchies and tensions of a closed community, is partially documented in the records of the Joseon court and in the memoirs and letters that some palace women produced. The Uinyo, the women physicians of Joseon Korea. Let's spend some time with the Uinyo, the female physicians of Joseon Korea, because they represent one of the more interesting examples of a specifically female professional role being created by the ideological requirements of the gender system itself. The Uinyo were established formally in the early Joseon period, when the government recognized a specific problem. The propriety conventions that governed women's interactions with men made it impossible for ordinary male physicians to examine female patients properly. A noble woman who was ill could not be examined by a male physician in the way that her examination would require, because the examination would involve a degree of physical contact and a degree of visibility that the propriety conventions governing women's bodies did not permit. The medical needs of women could not be met by the medical profession that the Joseon state had organized, because the profession was entirely male. The solution was to create female physicians. The Uinyo program, established formally in the reign of King Taejong in the early 15th century, trained women as medical practitioners specifically to provide medical care for women. The training included the study of the Korean and Chinese medical traditions, the accumulated knowledge of herbal medicine, of diagnosis, of the treatment of specific conditions, and it produced women who were recognized practitioners of a genuine medical tradition rather than simply informal caregivers. The Uinyo were trained in specific institutions, the Hyaman, the government medical office, and they were distributed to the regional governments throughout the kingdom to provide medical services to the women of their areas. They were also employed specifically in the palace, where they provided medical care to the palace women and to the royal family's female members. The social position of the Uinyo was a specific version of the paradox we have seen with the mudang and with the Gisaeng. A woman whose specific function was necessary to the social order was placed in a class position that the same social order stigmatized. The Uinyo were classified as Shaman, the same lowest class designation as the Gisaeng, which meant that they were looked down on by the same Yangban class whose women they were trained to treat. A noble woman who was treated by a Uinyo was receiving care from a woman who was socially below the servants in the noble household. The knowledge that the Uinyo held was nevertheless real and recognized as valuable. The medical texts that informed their training were the same texts that informed the training of male physicians. The Dongguae Bogam, the great Korean medical encyclopedia compiled by Hyo Jun in the early 17th century, was the foundation of both the male and female medical traditions in Korea, and the Uinyo who had mastered its contents had mastered a sophisticated body of medical knowledge. The daily practice of the Uinyo was organized around the specific medical needs of the women in her area. Childbirth was the most frequent and most dangerous of these, and the management of obstetric cases was one of the Uinyo's primary functions. The combination of the traditional Korean medical knowledge about pregnancy and birth with the Uinyo's specific training in gynecological medicine gave her a professional expertise that the informal midwifery knowledge of the community could not replicate. The written record of the Uinyo's practice is less extensive than we would wish. The medical cases they treated were not typically documented in the institutional records that preserve other aspects of Joseon history, but the specific testimonies that do survive, combined with the institutional records of the Uinyo training programs and the medical texts that formed the basis of their training, give us enough to understand the general character of their practice. The women who farmed the agricultural majority. Let's spend some time with the women who were the actual majority of Korean women in every period of the Joseon dynasty. The farm women of the Korean countryside whose daily labor was the material foundation of everything else. The Korean agricultural system was organized around rice cultivation in the river valleys and flat coastal areas and around the cultivation of various grains, millet, barley, sorghum, buckwheat, in the hillier interior regions. The management of the rice paddies, the flooded fields that produced the rice that was the staple of the Korean diet, was one of the most labor-intensive forms of agriculture in the world, requiring the management of water, the transplanting of rice seedlings, the weeding of the growing crop, and the harvesting of the mature rice, all in the specific seasonal window that the Korean climate provided. Women worked in the rice paddies alongside men during the most labor-intensive phases of the agricultural year. The planting, the transplanting of the rice seedlings from the seedbeds into the flooded paddies, done bent over in the water, placing each seedling in the specific pattern that the field required, was work that the entire available labor force of the community performed together. Women who transplanted rice were doing physically demanding work in cold water, bent over for hours, in the specific conditions of the Korean spring that made it both urgent and exhausting. The weeding of the growing rice was primarily women's work in the Korean agricultural tradition. The rice paddies required the removal of the competing plants that would reduce the yield, and this work was continuous through the summer growing season. It was work done in heat and humidity, bent over the plants, managing the specific ecosystem of the paddy that included not just the rice and the weeds, but the insects and the mud and the specific character of standing water in summer conditions. The domestic agricultural work, the kitchen garden that produced the vegetables for daily consumption, the management of the household stored food, the preservation of the autumn harvest for the winter months, was women's work without exception. The kimjang we mentioned at the beginning was the most intensive of these preservation activities, but the year-round work of managing the household's food supply, the drying of vegetables and fruits, the fermentation of various pastes and sauces, the management of the underground storage that the climate required, was a constant background activity of the farm woman's year. The textile production of the farm woman was more directly economically necessary than that of the Yangban woman, because the farm household did not have the resources to purchase the cloth it needed from commercial sources. The hemp that was the primary fiber of the commoner class, coarser than the silk of the elite but warm and durable, required the full sequence of production from the growing of the plant through the retting and the hackling and the spinning of the thread and the weaving of the cloth. This sequence ran through the winter months when the agricultural demands were lower, and the weaving room of the farm household was the primary scene of winter domestic life. The farm women's social world was the village, the community of related and neighboring households that shared the agricultural landscape, cooperated in the labor-intensive phases of the growing season, and maintained the social relationships that the community's survival required. The Korean village was typically organized around a dominant lineage, a clan group that shared an ancestor and that maintained the clan's collective identity through the ancestral rites, and the social institutions that the Confucian framework prescribed. Women in these lineage-organized villages were always, in the Joseon system, members of the clan they had married into rather than the clan they had been born into. The specific experience of moving from the birth family's village to the husband's family's village, which was often a substantial distance, was the defining transition of a Korean woman's life, the moment when everything familiar became strange and the process of building a new life in a new community began. The women who resisted specific stories of specific acts. Let's spend some time with the women who found specific ways to resist, to navigate, to push back against the constraints of the Joseon system in the specific ways that the system's particular character made possible. The literature of the Joseon period preserves some of these stories, though always filtered through the perspectives of the men who wrote most of what was written down. But the specific stories that survive, even in the filtered form, tell us something real about the specific acts of resistance that individual women managed. The Gasa literature, the long narrative poems in the specific Korean verse form called Gasa, was one of the primary vehicles for women's expression in the Joseon period, and the Gasa composed by women show a range of emotional and intellectual engagement with their world that the official ideology did not acknowledge women as being capable of. The Gasa composed by women in exile, wives who had followed their husbands into banishment, or who had been separated from their families by the various political upheavals of the Joseon period, express a directness about loss and longing and injustice that the formal Confucian literary style did not encourage. The letters written by women, the Ganjichop collections, preserve specific acts of intellectual and emotional resistance that are visible between the lines of the formal letter conventions. A woman who writes to her husband about the specific injustice of a legal situation affecting her family, and who analyzes the situation with a precision that makes the injustice unmistakable, is a woman using the available channels to make arguments that the formal public sphere would not hear from her. Lady Hyagaeong, the author of the Hanjungnak, the memoir she wrote late in her life describing the events of the Joseon court in the period of the tragic Prince Sado, who was her husband, is one of the most extensively documented individual Korean women of the entire Joseon period. Her memoir is a political document as well as a personal one. A careful, detailed account of the events surrounding her husband's death. He was killed by his own father, the king, who had him sealed in a rice chest and left to die. A story of such extraordinary horror that it has been the subject of considerable scholarly and literary attention, and a defense of her own family's conduct in those events. The memoir is remarkable in several ways. It is politically sophisticated in a way that the official ideology did not acknowledge women as being capable of. It is emotionally honest in a way that the formal Confucian literary culture typically did not permit. And it survives as one of the most important documents of the late Joseon period, read and studied and cited by historians who work with the period precisely because it documents events and perspectives that the official court records were not designed to preserve. Lady Hyagaeong was writing to defend herself and her family in a political situation of considerable danger. The aftermath of the tragic prince's death had political implications that continued to affect her family for generations. She was writing carefully, knowing that what she wrote would be read by powerful people with interests in the political interpretation of the events she described. And within these constraints, she produced a document of extraordinary historical value and considerable personal courage. The Weijin, the Flower Festival, and the Small Freedoms. Let's talk about the small freedoms, the specific occasions and spaces within the Joseon system where women's lives opened slightly, where the enclosure was temporarily relaxed, where the specific pleasures of the outdoor world and the social gathering were available in ways that the daily routine of the inner quarters did not provide. The Weijin, the Flower Festival, celebrated in the third lunar month when the spring flowers were blooming, was one of the occasions when women's outdoor presence in groups was not only permitted but celebrated. Women prepared the wajan, the flour pancakes made with the petals of the seasonal flowers, specifically the azalea and the forsythia, and gathered in groups at the mountains and streams that the spring landscape provided. The gathering was both a culinary and a social occasion, and the specific quality of freedom that the outdoor spring gathering represented, the relief from the enclosed indoor world of the inner quarters, the pleasure of the flowers and the fresh air and the company of other women, is something that the Korean poetic tradition captures with genuine feeling. The women who gathered for the wajan were not conducting subversive activities. They were participating in a culturally sanctioned seasonal celebration. But within the framework of the Joseon gender order, even this small outdoor freedom had a quality of relief and pleasure that the normal restrictions of the inner quarters gave it. The poems that Korean women wrote about the wajan, the sensory detail of the flowers, the quality of the spring air, the pleasure of the food and the company, are among the most vivid expressions of the specific emotional texture of the inner quarters life, because the contrast with the outdoor world makes both more visible. The Autumn Moon Festival, Chuseok, was another occasion of specific significance for women's lives. The preparation of the special foods for Chuseok, the songpyeon, the half-moon-shaped rice cakes filled with sesame or bean paste that were the characteristic food of the festival, was women's work, and the making of the songpyeon was a communal activity that brought women together in the same way that the kimjang brought them together in autumn. The tradition that beautifully made songpyeon meant the maker would have beautiful daughters was a piece of folk belief that added a playful competitive dimension to the communal cooking. The well was the other space of relative freedom for women of the lower classes. The fetching of water from the communal well was a necessity that was simultaneously a regular social occasion. The meeting of women at the water source, the conversations conducted in the brief moment of communal activity, was the small daily social life of the village women who could not easily arrange more formal gatherings. The gossip of the well, the news and the opinions and the assessments of the community's events, was the informal communication network of the village, and the women at the well were its nodes. The night and what it preserved. It is very late now. The ondal floor of the Korean house is still warm from the day's fire. The heat stored in the stone radiates through the night, and the family sleeping on the warm floor feels it even in the coldest January. The kimchi is fermenting in the ongi jars buried in the courtyard. The slow bacterial work that transforms cabbage and salt and gochugaru into one of the most complex flavors in the world, happening in the dark without anyone's attention. Hwang Jeannie's poems are in the anthologies. They were collected and preserved in the centuries after her death by scholars who recognized in them a quality that the Gisaeng social status did not explain and could not diminish. The winter night that she cut in half and folded away has been unfolded by readers for 500 years, and the specific image of managing absence through the management of time continues to be one of the most recognized and most quoted images in the Korean literary tradition. The mudang is between ceremonies. Her specific deity spirits are present with her in the way that her tradition understands their presence. The ongoing relationship with the spiritual beings who work through her, the continuous background of the practice even when no ceremony is being conducted. She will be called when she is needed, as she has always been called, as the mudang have always been called in Korea across the 1,000 years of the official ideology's attempt to replace her with something that worked better but never quite managed to. The widow is in her dead husband's household. The children are sleeping on the warm ondal floor around her. She manages the household's resources, prepares the ancestral rites, maintains the social relationships that the family's position requires. The memorial gate erected by the local government in her honor is visible from the household's outer wall, and the honor it represents is real in the terms of the value system she lives within, even as it is simultaneously a monument to everything she has given up. Lady Hyagaeong is writing. She writes late at night when the household's demands have subsided and the specific political situation that makes her writing necessary. The defense of her family, the preservation of her account of events that powerful people might prefer to see interpreted differently, requires the hours that the night provides. Her memoir will be read for 300 years after her death. It will be published in English translation in 1996. Scholars in the 21st century will cite it in their work on 18th century Korean court history. The memoir she wrote to defend herself and her family in the specific political circumstances of the late 18th century will outlast the political circumstances by centuries. Korea has changed. The ondol is now heated by gas rather than wood. The kimchi is still made in autumn in most Korean households, the tradition of the kimjang persisting through a century of Japanese occupation and 2 generations of rapid economic development and urbanization. The mudang is on the UNESCO list. Hwang Jini is on television. There have been multiple Korean drama series about her life, which is a form of cultural permanence that she probably did not anticipate. The inner quarters are gone, or more precisely, they have been transformed beyond recognition. The specific spatial organization of the Joseon household that encoded the gender ideology in the architecture of daily life is not the spatial organization of the Korean apartment of the 21st century. The ideology has changed too, incompletely and unevenly but genuinely, in the specific way that ideologies change when the material conditions that sustain them no longer exist. But the kimchi is still being made. The mudang is still being called. The poems of Hwang Jini are still being read. The winter night is still long, and someone somewhere is still figuring out how to fold it away and keep it safe until it is needed again. Sleep well. Good night.